what is discernment? How do you discern gifts? Why discern gifts in community? And many other questions. That's what we're going to talk about today on the podcast. Welcome back, everybody. Ryan, Father Ryan, Deacon Courtney, welcome back. Thanks for helping out with this conversation. Real quick, how are we doing, folks?
I'm doing great. You look a little tired, Shawn.
I am exhausted today.
How did you sleep last night?
I did not sleep well last night, so I'll be drinking coffee. I'll try to not drink into the mic, but I'm definitely going to need this cup.
Yeah.
But you guys look like bright and energetic and well rested.
It's my matcha green tea, which I discovered on our trip to Japan, and it is golden.
You have been
it's changed my
on
life.
This kick.
Yeah. So,
Ryan, any thoughts about that?
I got better sleep last night than I had the previous night, so I'm feeling good. We've just had a busy season of life, and with our kids not in school yet, it feels like we've had a lot going on, getting ready for the school year, but they're not in school yet. Yeah. So just that right before school starts, it's that kind of a little bit of a craziness that we're experiencing right now.
What's funny is watching the transformation of parents who are like, when summer's coming, they're like, oh, sweet, summer's coming. And then when school's coming, they're like, thank God.
We can't wait. Yeah.
Well, I know you probably don't appreciate it now, but like, I don't even see my kids now they're in high school. So yeah.
One day we will look back and be like, I wish for those days again, I'm sure. But right now we're very excited to have the structure and all that stuff. So,
yeah. What?
I was just saying, I'm really happy not to see my kids. No, that's not true. I love my kids. It's so much fun to be with them. But I'm not looking back at when, they were
so glad
toddlers.
You're listening to this right now, Annabelle and Liam. Yeah.
Every season has its gifts.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's so true. Speaking of gifts,
what?
Nice
look
segue.
at that.
You see that? Bam!
That
was so good.
Serve that up on a platter for you, Shawn. You're welcome.
No, was that intentional? Did you set me up?
I mean, kind of in the back of my mind. But
I appreciate it.
Yeah,
you made it.
But I don't want to like rush I know you like the warm ups. I don't want to rush that either.
Well, listen. When I listen to podcasts, I like to know the people that are talking. I like to just.
I know, but they're a lot funnier than I am too.
That's true.
So,
but authenticity is like a helpful thing. I'm just trying to give a peek into like. We're not just clergy robots. We're underslept and have problems too.
Yep.
Well, let's jump into it though. Right. That's enough of the banter with discernment. And I thought it would be a helpful way to just give some context to this, maybe define some terms, and then give a bunch of examples and talk our way through it. But the reason we're talking about this is because recently we've been in preaching through Ephesians. And in Ephesians 4, there was a passage that I preached on a few weeks back about gifts and how God has given certain gifts to the church for the sake of the church to build up the body, to help equip the saints is what Ephesians 4 is talking about. And really, like if I was to summarize what Paul is getting after here, is Paul is saying on the basis of love, in union with God, and right before the section, he even talks about Christ ascending and descending as a way of underlining or underscoring the point that Christ is authoritative, and from that place of authority, that same Christ who fills all, is in all, that Christ has given gifts to the church. So on that basis, there's this there's this wealth of generosity and gifts that comes from the one who has ascended and descended, and for what? And sort of where I was going with the sermon was a little bit different, but I've been thinking about that passage ever since, and the need for everybody in the church to take a moment to discern and to ask some of the deeper questions about why am I here? Like what do I have to bring to the table? What do I contribute? And not for some sort of self-interested way, but for the sake of building up the body, for maturing believers, for equipping the saints. And ultimately, when I have just reread that passage, I was like, I think Paul's saying here, this is actually for us to be able to participate in the mission of God in the world. Mm-hmm. Actually, I should just read it because I think I have it here, just so it's all queued up for everybody. This is Ephesians 4, verses 11 through 16. It says this: the gifts he gave were that some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until all of us come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to maturity, to the measure of the full stature of Christ. We must no longer be children, tossed to and fro and blown about by every wind of doctrine, by people's trickery, their craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we must grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by every ligament with which it is equipped, as each part is working properly, promotes the body's growth in building itself up in love. That is a lot. That is classic Paul, right? There's so many images and spaces that we could talk a lot. But that's the text that's been floating around my head. And I think it's really fascinating for us to be able to sit down with everybody in our church and have this conversation. So this is why we're talking about it on the podcast. And so we would also love to hear from you. If in this conversation and you're reflecting, you're like, hey, I have a question, or actually I want to talk to somebody about this, we would love to hear from you. So please reach out to us. So that's the context. That's sort of the setup. Let's jump into this. What do we mean by discern? I'll say this, when you guys say that to people as ministry leaders or just in Christian community, because there's a lot to discern in people's lives. We say that word. Mm-hmm. What is it we mean? What is it we don't mean? Could you help define that just real practically, like nuts and bolts? How do you use that word? What does it mean to you?
Yeah. I feel like it's almost become a little bit overused.
Yeah, totally. It's so like a buzzword.
Starting with the definition is helpful. I mean, discernment isn't just like thinking about a decision. It's not like, discerning whether to have burgers or pizza for dinner.
Right.
It's something I think.
Discerning dinner.
Yeah.
It feels like that sometimes.
I think it tends to be something weightier. So we talk about it here in terms of discerning your spiritual gifts for vocation or for use in ministry. And I think that's a really important aspect of discernment, which we're really, as clergy, immediately involved in people's lives. But I think discernment can also extend beyond that. So you can be discerning around relational issues, but ultimately I think what really makes it discernment, the way we talk about it, is you really are looking for where is God at work here? Like you're trying to hear from God, and you're trying to hear God speaking into your life about a decision that is really weighing or impacting your heart.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. And that can take on different shapes. Like that looks different for different things. So for instance, as a community, we just went through a very significant season of discernment last year. So you can have communal discernment over huge things, but you can also have more personal discernment about not less important things, but just different kinds of things like gifting. So, but it's a buzzword because discernment happens so much, I think. And that's because it's really important, because actually every Christian should have discernment going on kind of all the time, maybe in some ways, right? So it should be a pretty common thing. So if people are listening to this and going, I've never really discerned intentionally some things. I mean, it's something you should probably consider. It's really good, that kind of thoughtfulness.
Yeah, and I think it's we'll talk more later, I'm sure, but it is sort of a practice, a discipline.
Right.
There's different ways to go about it. So it is something that you don't just immediately know how to do.
Right. And there's bad ways of doing it and better ways of doing it. Ryan, you were talking about discernment earlier when we're talking about setting up this podcast as something that happens is sort of a spiritual awareness or an awareness of what God is doing. Can you talk a little bit about that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. I mean, the discerning has to do with, there's so much to unpack here. I feel like I don't even know where to start, to be honest, but I think there is a sense in which when we make decisions, and we talk about this in our shape class a little bit, but this idea that typically we focus on making the right decision based on right beliefs or right behavior, or in the Christian life especially, it's well, I need to live this way, or I need to think the right thing, or I need to, as opposed to getting down deeper into our desires and the things that motivate us and kind of fund the deeper kind of orientations of our life that often lead us to certain kinds of beliefs and practices.
Give an example, or how do you talk to yourself? What's the self-talk sound like? This is my way in of sort of grasping what you're getting at. What's the self-talk that one might use to get after those deeper things that are funding that discernment? You know what I'm saying?
Good question.
Like, I guess what occurs to me, maybe I should just answer, is asking the question, what is this really about? When you have these sort of prompts, or like discernment often for me is triggered by a discomfort, right? Or something's not quite right, or there's like some challenge or some turning point. And I hear what you're saying is taking a moment to ask some questions, get deeper, not just solve the problem or check out from the problem or that discomfort, but actually to like descend into the thing and go, hey, what's going on here? What's this really about?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. Cause I think Augustine talks about this. There's lots of, the scriptures speak to this, that, the things that we say, that we do, are all funded by the loves, the desires, the things that actually motivate us from underneath the surface. And we're typically not aware of those things, or, unless we've cultivated that awareness. It's oftentimes, we make decisions that are like up here, but we're never actually getting underneath the surface to understand, gosh, this is actually what's motivating this in my life. Did you have something to share, Courtney?
Oh, I was thinking of an example.
Yeah. Give it to us.
And this is really around vocational discernment, and kind of reflecting on my own experience. But I think Parker Palmer, who wrote a book on Let Your Life Speak, which that's a good book. But he talks about the difference between like birthright gifts and like something else, and discernment. At least in vocational discernment, it's really trying to figure out what are your birthright gifts versus what are the things that have been sort of externally imposed on you. So, I grew up thinking that, my work in the church was limited to some pretty specific things, in sort of a complementary environment that as a woman, my work in the church is really around, caring for children and preparing meals. And so I grew up like living into that. And even though I personally, I love kids, but I found like babysitting tedious and didn't love it. I was like, but this is just what I do. Right. And so those were sort of the gifts that were given to me from the external places. And I mean, it took years to like figure out what are my actual birthright gifts, because they look different. And so sorting through like what may be coming from other voices or coming from outside or coming from external expectations and pressures, and discovering what has God actually placed in your heart.
So, but there's like, that's a great example, because there's some factors involved there that either box in what you discern or even introduce new information. So knowing your story and knowing sort of the tradition that you've come from, and really a lot of us have come from, there is a reading of scripture that boxes in like views of women in ministry, for instance, right? And then and you ask the questions within that frame, right? But then you enter a new community, a different community that doesn't see it that way, and then you begin to get input that's like new information, or that gets added into this discernment of like, wait a second, is there more that I can do than watching kids? I think there is, actually. And so you have this community around you saying, hey, Courtney, I think there's something going on with you and your call and your ministry and what you're doing. And in fact, Courtney, I think you should challenge the frame that you've been handed. And I know this story, I know your story personally, so I'm sort of referencing it here, but I think that translates to other people's situations too. You may have a set of expectations about the way things should go, and you maybe for reasons of fear, or you're risk averse or whatever, or it's not a possibility because of the way you read scripture, or what you expect, what you've always known, that those kinds of things can box in our discernment process. And oftentimes we find in community and in scripture, honestly, that frame being challenged, that is sort of poking holes in it and going, wait a second, isn't there more to this? That's another great internal question. Like, is there more to this?
Yeah. And I think that you point to the example of maybe the church's frame in my story, but we have family frames, right?
Yeah.
So maybe like familial expectations around what it means to be successful or live a valuable, worthwhile life. You may have, kind of more friendships outside of the church or community outside the church. You may have professional environments. So you may have all these different frames, as you call them, sort of forming you and kind of maybe interfering with true discernment because they just kind of flow in that river without really thinking through, like, why do I pursue the things I pursue? Or why do I care about the things I care about? Why am I living my life, chasing these things? And so an important part of discernment is like stopping and trying to sort of clear out or look past or beyond those things into what's really deep within your own heart.
Yeah. I think so. If there are these frames that get imposed on us that we have to be open to, like those things being dismantled or sort of disrupted, how do we not go off the rails with discernment and just go, you know what, I'm gonna do this crazy thing, like that's just so there's like, for instance, Ryan, I'm summarizing because this is actually really interesting to me. Mm-hmm. I'm hearing the questions you're proposing are like awareness, self-awareness, and getting to the deeper desires. Like, what's this really about? Because some discernment can be just stroking an ego, right? Or self-interested. Mm-hmm. And so being aware of the deeper motivations is super healthy and helpful and good and godly, right? And then Courtney, in your story, I'm hearing like, and we're bound by certain frames that we're given, and that's not always bad. But how do you tell how do you test the spirits, the scripture says, right? And tell, is this of God or not? And I think in my own life, the story that comes to mind is I know it's so cliche. You got three clergy sitting around a table talking about their call to ministry, but it's our stories are just so impactful for our whole lives. And so it's just a prominent example. But I remember I was an engineer. I've told the church this, sort of accidentally started this youth group. And I found myself in one of the richest moments of my relationship with God that I've ever had in my life, in prayer and in contemplation and in community and in ministry. There was just it was a special time of intimacy with God that I still look back at and think, wow, I was journaling things and just, and I go back and read and I can recognize this was a special moment, special time. And it was in that moment of communion with God, of union with God, that God was speaking really clearly and moving really powerfully and really challenging things. And so if I'm going to offer another piece to the equation here is and to answer the question, how do we not go off the rails? Well, in union with God and God's people is critical. Mm-hmm. I think discernment in isolation or in self-interested ways are disastrous. They can be really hurtful to you and to other people. And so as a Christian, we have this, and this is what Paul's talking about in Ephesians 4, when he says being rooted and grounded in love. Paul's image is, there's almost an assumption that he makes explicit here, which is discernment of these gifts in the church begins in union with God, being rooted and grounded, not in ego or self-interest or dreams or something, or whatever other motivation, but being centered in and planted on union with God in Christ. And when we do that, the frames that need to be challenged will be challenged, I think. Right. And the inner motivations, God can like reveal these things to us. And we won't always get it right. We shouldn't be afraid of taking the risks and challenging those things and inspecting those things. But with God's help, with the Spirit's help, that's the work of discernment, which can be kind of scary, but actually but it comes from a place of union with God. I think that's like really, really critical.
Yeah. And I would add to that God is very patient, and it can be a slow, gentle process, right, too. I mean, you think of, in your story, it sounds a little dramatic, right? You're right. Like, I'm going to stop being an engineer and I'm going to, follow my call and go to seminary. And it was a rather relatively quick thing in your life. I mean, for me, it took like 20 years. And so, I think that if people are worried about going off the rails and you sense a call to something, but you don't know what it is.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's not like you're failing if you don't have it figured out in the next 6 months, because God could be like laying groundwork for something in your life that may take years and years and years to really fully develop.
Yeah.
And God's not going to force you to do anything, I don't think. I'm not God, but that's been my experience. God doesn't force us. God invites us. He just God invites us into a richer, fuller, more just beautiful way of life.
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, what's funny is when I was discerning a call to ministry, and I sort of, like, honey, I told Michelle, I think that's what I'm supposed to do. She's like, I've known this. You're such kind of like you're a dummy. Because even in high school, I was in high school telling my dad, who's a minister, Dad, I think I want to go into ministry. And he's like, no, you don't. Do something else. But I was working. It was a multi-year. I mean, it was like probably a decade of wrestling, and that discomfort wouldn't go away. That pushed me into that discernment. And I could tell you the stories about even when Michelle and I decided to come to Austin to plant this church, the amount of discernment that went into that. And some of the features of that discernment is always begins with some discomfort, some unsettledness that drives us into a curiosity about what's going on inside us, what's going on in the community, what God's doing. And it is a longer process. It's kind of clumsy, and you feel like you're just feeling around in the dark a little bit. And then it's just constant. You're just discovering, getting new information, saying, God, I'm listening, and listening to God's people. And especially the more significant of a decision it is, the more time and patience and community will help, I think.
Yeah.
But
I describe it like my time as a lawyer. It felt like, for 20 years, it felt like walking around in shoes that didn't quite fit. You keep walking in them, but it's getting increasingly uncomfortable. And so I think especially around vocational discernment, or if you feel like God, maybe something, you feel this tap, you don't have to do something necessarily immediately, but you pay attention to that. Pay
attention to that. Yeah, that's a good word.
I often liken discernment to like tending to a garden, which I use that a lot, I think. But I think it's there is a sense in which like there's this long, slow work of trying to pulling weeds out, kind of getting after the thing that you're trying to do to grow this gift or whatever it might be that you're discerning, obviously. But there is this just long, slow work of tending to something, like tending to your desires, tending to this thing that you feel like maybe God is calling you to do, or whether it's a decision to move and start something new, or to just like step into like living, into your gifting, whatever that might be.
Mm-hmm.
There's just that long, slow work of tending to it and just being faithful to it. And honestly, discernment doesn't, like, I'm thinking about an example for me has been that like I felt called to ministry in part because I had this deep desire to care for people, and this like pastoral care, like I just, it just feels like God has given me this gift, this calling. But early on, one of the biggest struggles for me was that I think I wrestled with, is this just like codependency? Like, is this just like a need to be cared by other people? So I'm going to care for them to kind of receive something from them. And that like, so there's always this kind of sense of, is this just like unhealthy, something or other, like, am I just doing this because I want the gratification of like that person feeling cared for? And so that was something that I really had to discern. Like, is this like an unhealthy desire or an unhealthy thing that is motivating me to ministry? Or is it actually God's calling me into this? And actually the interesting thing about that is that like that discernment hasn't gone away. I'm always having to discern that.
Right.
Like,
you don't go, nope, it's not, I'm clear. And then you just move on.
Right. Like the gift that God has given me is also something that I need to continue to pay attention to make sure it doesn't veer off into some unhealthy, thing. Or, so I think even with our gifts, like there's always discernment happening. I don't think it's like a one and done thing. It's like, well, this is what I'm gifted in. I'm going to go off and.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Cause it's ongoing, right? We don't it never stops.
And that's why the tending to the garden thing I think is appropriate, because it's like, you want to allow this thing to grow, but you still have to tend to it after the fact, and I think that's a really helpful way that I've thought about it, at least.
So in Ephesians 4, I want to return to this because you're naming sort of a pastor gift that you have, a shepherd gift that you have, and we're all different. And so Paul's talking about not only in Ephesians 4, but in Romans 12, he talks about the many members of the body, but we're one body. So this image comes up a lot for Paul. But what's really helpful about this is it's like in in the same way that like personality tests or gift tests or like Enneagram things like help put language to the various aspects of people's lives and gifts, it feels like this is Paul doing that for Christians. Like, hey, some
the
of you
original
this.
Enneagram.
Yeah, the OG Enneagram. But I think that one of the mistakes we can make in reading this list from Paul, which is verse 11 says the gifts he gave were that some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers. The mistake we can make is to go, oh, I know what that is. It's a specific role, and that's like, and that's a paid staff thing at a church.
Mm-hmm.
Like that would be a total mistake. That is not what is in Paul's mind here. I imagine.
Well, he lists different gifts in different passages, so it's
right. Totally.
Yeah, there's some give there depending on his audience.
Right, but I think part of this for Paul is like when he says, for instance, I just want to walk through this just as an example that you gave us, Ryan, that some would be apostles. Our buddy Matt Tedby preached a great sermon on this same passage because we're all preaching from the lectionary, and he unpacked these in really helpful ways. I'm not going to do it justice, but briefly, apostles are the kinds of people that like to start new things, people who like to take risks, people who, when others say that's impossible, no way, that's a bad idea, are only motivated by it. They don't need everyone's buy-in to be motivated to go after something. They will just go after something. And there's an energy, a special joy or excitement in people like this that God has given a gift to do some of that work. If you look back at the history of the church, can you imagine if we didn't have people like that? Not just actual bishops and apostles, but lay people too, who feel called to go start something or to get after something risky, and the church pointing to them and saying, "Wow, that's amazing! Look what God did." So you know, if you may have a sort of apostolic characteristic in you, if those are your inclinations, I feel like I could talk about that because I feel those inclinations in me. I'm like a serial entrepreneur. This tell me I can't do it, and it just actually motivates me to try. You guys know it just is sort of that energy. Then you have prophets. Folks might be prophets. I'm curious what you guys would think about this, but prophets aren't necessarily people who can read your mind or tell the future, but certainly the prophets warn of what God is going to do. And I say warn because it's often a confrontation, a challenge. And so prophets are the kinds of people who can say the hard word, not in malicious or provocative ways, but the word of a sense of, again, being in union with God, of naming the future that God is making and calling people into alignment with that is a prophetic thing. And I think what makes someone uniquely have like prophetic characteristics is they don't mind the challenge. They don't mind the conflict. They don't mind standing aside from the pack, being singled out. They don't mind speaking up, and they don't mind sort of the cost even. I don't think they revel in the pain of that or the frustration that may come of that. But there's something that is really motivating. It's like an energy, a joy in that. So there's like these prophetic kinds of gifts. Evangelists are the kinds of people who have to get you jacked up on that thing that they're jacked up on. If like I see some of this in myself as well, but when you get excited about something, like you go watch a movie or you went and tried out a new restaurant, an evangelist type of person is someone who won't shut up about that thing and will tell you the ways of how amazing it is. Paul obviously is talking about, in this sense, evangelists are those who can't stop, who won't shut up about the kingdom of God, who won't stop talking about Jesus Christ that they know, that they've met and are transformed by. And everybody needs to know about this. So there's this excitement. There's a desire to communicate. There's the fear here is like, well, what if people think I'm foolish or stupid? What if they think that what I'm into is actually not that exciting? It's something that they're managing, but these are the kinds of people who are willing to, kind of like the prophet, say something, but actually to win people to the beauty and the truth and the goodness of Christ and his kingdom. And so you may have evangelistic characteristics if you're like, for instance, hey, you should serve in the children's classes with me because it's amazing. Can I tell you about what it's like to teach these kids, to love these kids, and the experience that I have? Like, oh my gosh, I got to tell you about this. You should come with me. You should do this with me. Is an evangelistic sort of gifting, a characteristic in people's lives. Pastors, Ryan, this is like front and center. What comes to mind with you and shepherding, and I can see it so clearly because it's I think truly a gift in your life. Courtney, you too. Honestly, working with you two, I'm like, oh, that's what it's like to be gifted as a pastor, as a shepherd. Whereas sometimes, like I have a gas tank that is gets tapped out quickly in being with or walking with people in slow, like heavy or like costly ways. You guys have an energy about that actually that I notice that I don't have as much. Ryan, especially you have a natural gifting for like shepherding and pastoring people. Why don't I stop talking? How would you describe if someone's not ordained, but they may have pastoral gifting in their life, characteristics of pastors in people's lives? How does that present? How do you think that might show up in like a layperson's life where they go, oh yeah, I think that's my jam. I could be that kind of person.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's it really is hard to describe, especially if you don't have that gift in a lot of ways, because it is just like this sense of you're comfortable around the hurts of others, the pains that they're experiencing. You have a sense that it's like, this is where I need to be. I need to be present to this person. So a lot of it is ministry of presence. Not feeling like you have to have the right answer. You don't have to be, a prophet to them in the moment, even though there might be something that they need to see or hear. It's just being present in the way that Jesus is present to people in their pain. And
there's also a sensing part of this, I think, that I've noticed in you, which is you have like you can read the room, you can read people, and not like you're reading their minds, but you have a sense of where they're at, what they're feeling, what they may be dealing with. You sort of have a gift of imagining what it's like to be them.
Yeah.
Compassionately, and inviting that, like creating the space where that can come out, where they can talk about that, or
sure.
You know what I'm saying?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think, and it's one of those things where it's like, I think people know if they're pastors or not. They just feel really comfortable around other people. They have a way of, just like you said, like reading the room or just being attentive to the people who have needs, being attentive to the people who maybe are at the margins. You're just kind of always aware of those things, even if you're even not necessarily with them in the moment. And there's just a lot of shadow sides. I think there's probably shadow sides to all gifting, right? But like there's obviously ways that can go in all sorts of ways terribly too, right? Where it's like you're not thinking about yourself. You're just like always thinking about everyone else. Right. You're like, I mean, there's just a lot there, but yeah, I think that's probably the best way to describe it is you deeply desire to see people cared for and to see people healed or known or seen, that kind of thing. So
yeah. Courtney, you strike me on a few of these gifts as well, but the last one strikes me with you, and I'm wondering what you think about this. A teacher sort of characteristic is someone who loves helping other people discover something, to learn something, to grow. Like if you're thrilled when you can help someone grow or have like an epiphany or just realize something, you're like, oh, I love that. You might have a sort of teaching characteristic. When, for instance, the reason you come up in my mind, when we like prepare classes and you and Melissa Gray are both the same. I mean, she's literally was a teacher, and still is. But you strive to bring simplicity and clarity. You almost overthink in a good way. Like you have to actually like develop the thing to make it more clear, more simple. Why? Not because you're obsessed with clarity and simplicity, but because you want this thing to be graspable by people. Mm-hmm. You want people to be able to go, oh, I get it. And I know you, because you've been working on our Send class, but you really enjoy making things accessible and understandable. And I think you really enjoy when people have those moments around you where they get it, where they grow in certain ways. Is that a misread, or am I on target here?
No, I think that's right. But I think that you have to expand your imagination, like you were just doing, for what some of these gifts look like. Because like when you think of a teacher, it's easy to think of, the scholar who's like standing up front in the of the classroom, saying really eloquent things and like capturing everyone's attention. And that's not me. But I do love the process of making things understandable for people. And so like in my sermons, I don't get a lot of feedback that I'm like this super charismatic speaker, but people like, they may remember like a nugget or two from my sermon, and they may remember it like months, occasionally like months down the road. And I'm like, okay, well that's what I was trying to accomplish. And also like facilitating groups, I really enjoy. So me not just conveying information, but trying to help people like discover it for themselves. So I think when we are reflecting on our spiritual gifts, like don't get boxed in to, don't let your imagination get limited by what you think the gift has to look like, because that's the way you've always seen it.
So shifting gears, because this is a great segue actually, from Ephesians 4 and those sets of gifts. By the way, just real quick, listener, you should pay attention to that. If something that we described in that list of gifts pings that you're curious about, and it's probably a couple of those things, pay attention to that. Ask God about that. Ask yourself, what's this about? Ask those around you who know you well. Do you see this in my life? This can be a really, really fruitful, super exciting thing. And you know where I'm going with this. I want to talk about your experience with your discernment committee.
Yeah, we can. But before we go there, I also just want to say, don't limit yourself to like this list either.
Right.
I mean, what
There's
is
more.
the thing that is like, what is the thing that's like causing a little fire in your heart, or that does the thing that makes you feel the most alive when you do it? Because that very well could be your gift, even if it's something that, as I often see, people are afraid to acknowledge to anybody else. So, okay,
That's a good word.
What was your
it's great. So
question?
we can actually expand on even that point, because with just a real practical example of the story of this discernment group that you've been experiencing, and everybody that I've bumped into who's part of this group. If you don't know, Courtney is discerning a call to the priesthood, which for the rest of us is like, no duh, like, come on, let's go. But actually it's a requirement in the process, but also a really, really beneficial experience for not only for you, for others, but for others. And the other people I've run into who are part of this group, this is always the first thing they talk about. It's so thrilling to them.
They're a great group. Shout out to my PDC.
Yeah. So
They're
what's
amazing.
it like? Tell us about the group and tell us what the point is and what it's like to be in the hot seat.
Yeah. So discerning for the priesthood, I mean, that's a very intentional discernment process with a lot of structure around it, because it's a fairly significant thing, to become a priest. And so the diocese has a process for discernment, which includes gathering a committee together to meet over a series of 6 weeks and to really just walk alongside you and discern, is this really a call that God has placed on your life? And I'll be honest, like I was kind of ambivalent about it going into it.
Why? What do you mean? Why so?
Well, I think that like I really hadn't done group discernment in that way, particularly around vocation, because maybe it's being Gen X, maybe it's being like in sort of the law firm corporate world, like there's no discernment like that. It's like you figure it out. Like you figuring out your future is like, it's a very independent thing. And in fact, like turning to people and like, hey, what do you think? You think I'm really gifted in this? Like, that's a sign of kind of weakness, right? So that just, I don't think I had the tools or the imagination for like what that was supposed to look like. And I think there was a part of me that was probably like prideful, like not in a good way. That's like, I don't really need a group for this, like I can figure this out on my own.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Were you surprised?
Yeah. So I it's a requirement, right? So, and thankfully Ryan Betcher and, Krista Gregg and some other people were like, no, we're going to make this happen. I also had a deadline. I had to get it done this summer, and the summer was busy for all of us. So I didn't want to put this burden on our people to have to do this over the summer, but they're like, no, we are going to make this happen for you. And even that was like really profound for me, because the fact that people cared that much to invest in me in this way was like, that did some really good work. So then we met, and I'll kind of short story. I mean, I think it gave me what I needed. And so that's why it's like, there's no like one size fits all discernment, because I think everybody who's discerning something, they just need something different.
Mm-hmm.
And I do believe they need something that they probably can't provide themselves, because God speaks through other people. And so we need God speaking through other people in love and truth into our lives, to helping us see things that we just can't see.
Mm.
And in my case, I think what I was really struggling with and sort of taking that next step to submit the application for the priesthood is just not feeling qualified to do
Mm-hmm.
it. That's just been sort of the monkey on my back for years, sure, for a variety of reasons. But, I grew up in a context where women weren't leaders in that way. I haven't came to this later in life, so I haven't been pursuing this for, the last 30 years. I started in my mid-40s. So just for a variety of reasons, I just didn't feel qualified. And it took this body of people who just were able to give me the confidence and the courage to just really embrace it and move forward. And I'm super grateful for that.
The gift of community. So discernment in community is a new thing for probably most people. Like maybe they've never even done that. But what I hear you saying is there's a really important and unique gift that comes from doing this in a group with people who love you, who know you, who are invested in your life, who are also walking with God, and can hear together in community. It seems right, like good and right to us, right? Like something you're discerning. And what I love about this is, so oftentimes when we discern, again, we have that frame, we have the set of like, here's the possible outcomes, but to get in the kitchen really with a group of people, you're not in control of that.
Yeah.
You will be likely surprised. People will say, here's what I see, in ways that are just maybe you didn't expect, you didn't see.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've found, because we've all done these discernment committees, is that in those moments when you're like, should I really be doing this? You can lean on, these people said I should. Even when you doubt yourself, the gift of community is you have other voices to lean on other than your own.
Yeah.
You can get out of your own head a little bit, right?
Yeah. And like I said, I mean, that was what gave me what I needed in my experience. I mean, for some people, and often these discernment committees will result in a person deciding, or maybe the group deciding that, lay ministry or something different
Mm-hmm.
is really the call that God has placed on your life. So I think that they can give people, help them see maybe truths that they can't see on their own because they're boxed in. So it gives them an objective point of view. Maybe it shows like, again, Parker Palmer talks about finding the way closed. You think that you're being called to go in this direction and you hit the way closed, which actually it can be hard, but it actually means the way is open somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So it can help you find this sort of way closed and the way open.
That's good. I do think, because I helped a lot with getting the process sorted out, and for Courtney and for others, and some of the frameworks for like discernment towards ordained ministry that you did with this parish discernment committee, like they speak to what like the discernment process that we all can take, right? Like any Christian, if you're discerning your gifts, in this process, this committee process, it's you're discerning a call from above and a call from below. So as we've just talked about, you're trying to hear from God this call and discern this call from Him, this personal thing between you and God, but then also from below, meaning like you're inviting this community of people to speak into your life, to affirm this gift or to discern this with you. We can do that. Like any of our parishioners can do this work. It's not a formal parish discernment committee, especially if it's just like discerning, should I offer my gifts to help out on Sunday mornings with setup or takedown? Like you don't need a parish discernment committee to discern that, but you might need people in your life to say, hey, here's how I see your gifting. I see you're really good at this. Maybe you should try this out in the church. Or, gosh, you've got a really great voice. Maybe you should go consider helping out with the music team, things like that. But then also, I think there's a secondary process that happens, which is kind of integral to the parish discernment committee, which is you're discerning your calling. That's the primary thing you're doing, is how has God called you to participate in the life of the church, building up the body, as it talks about in the scriptures. So that's the primary focus of the parish discernment committee. But then it's also saying how does your character, like discerning your character, discerning that, your walk with Jesus, your life in the way that it's manifested, does your life speak to being able to fulfill this calling? Like, does your character, things like that. So discerning, like, gosh, am I living my life in such a way where I can actually live into this calling well?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like,
totally.
And that's part of, I think, what you guys were talking about in the parish discernment committee. And then also the competencies that go with
like skill sets.
Like discerning, like, do I have the competencies to do this thing? And in most cases, it's all those things are connected, right? Like it's like, yeah, that's why I want to do this, is because I feel like I'm competent to be a teacher, or
I'm
to
good
be
at this,
that kind of thing. Like, those are all the things that you guys were talking about, working out and saying, like, yeah, I do feel competent in this, or man, I feel competent, but here's some things that I can work on to be better at this, or that I know I'm going to need to develop eventually, or things like that. I think those frameworks are actually really helpful to think about discerning, like, just like, what do I want to, like, as a parishioner at Res, like, how can I serve the church? How can I use my gifts? Like, I think it has to do with, gosh, what am I good at? Like, what are the things that, like, gosh, I get really excited about doing, and I'm really actually, I love welcoming people. I love making coffee, or I love going out and blowing the leaves off our sidewalk in the morning. I just love serving people in that way. But then also, like, do I have the character to, like, back this up? Like, gosh, I need to tend to that part of this too. Like, if I'm going to be up front, I need to have the kind of life that, like, exhibits the ability to, like, live out this calling, if that makes sense. So I love how the framework of that can actually be applied then to anyone. That's probably over complicating it in some ways.
There may be a simpler, like, the way I think of it in more simple terms is, like, there's a subjective and then kind of an objective component to discernment. So there's a subjective, like, what do I feel? Like, what do I feel called to do? But there's an objective, like, well, what are the actual needs of the church or the community? What are you in a position to actually be able to do? Like, and as a priest, it's like, can I move anywhere? Is my family supporting this? Am I financially stable in a place where I can take this on? So, and like you said, the character and competency. So, and really, I think God works through both. I mean, not just through the call in your heart, but through, like, what are the circumstances surrounding you? What are the needs surrounding you? So, I mean, sometimes you could feel, oh, I feel a strong call to do this, but your life isn't set up to support you in that work.
Right.
So it may be, this isn't the time.
Right.
Or maybe your work is different. So I think it's important that people take both into account. If you're going to think about leading classes on a Sunday morning for the kids, can you consistently be at church to show up and be able to do that? So
yeah, this is really practical. So if you're listening and you're thinking, all right, well, this is a lot of helpful information. There's a whole world of consideration here when it comes to discerning what our gifts are and what we do with them, right? I'm wondering if there's if we could brainstorm, if someone came up to us and said, but where do I start? Step one, how do I get moving here? What would be your first take on that?
I like what Courtney was shared earlier. So I'm not putting you on the spot, but the now and quote that you shared earlier was, like, a really simple way of saying, this is where we start. The one about the...
Yes.
Give it to us.
Okay.
Can you... Not that you were going to say that. Maybe you had a different...
I'm happy to chime in. Okay, Henry Nouwen, in his book Spiritual Direction, which is a great book, by the way, if you're looking for a place to start, you can read that book. But he writes, the ministry of the body of Christ is not really something that you try to do, although it calls you to do many things. Ministry is the fruit of finding your gifts and offering what you have. That's
really insightful. Finding your gifts and offering what you have. So let's say someone is, I love Nouwen's framing of this, but someone is going, okay, so how do I find my gifts? How do I offer what I have? I think if I was to take a stab at this, the first thing I would say is get moving, try something. I think oftentimes we can imagine, well, I got to sit in a closet with the lights out and pray and then wait for inspiration, likely, I mean, chances are you're already doing something. If you're not doing something, do something. But I would say maybe this isn't for everybody, but I think it is. You have to argue with me about this, but try something. Like if you're like, I don't know what my gifts are, find a place to serve. Find a place to do something, to host people in your home. Like our table group leaders, they didn't wake up one day and they're like, you know what? God's called me to host a table group. They probably were part of a group and thought, wow, look at this. I could do this. Huh.
Or they had people say, hey, you're good at this.
Right.
Yeah.
But I guess my point is step one, get moving. Like pay attention and get moving, get active, do something. And if you are like, you know what, I'm going to, like, I love people like, what should I do? What does the church need? Serve in our family ministry. And they're like, well, I'm not sure, but just serve. And trust me, like, you'll either learn really quickly, like, no, this isn't my jam, or wait a second, I was surprised by this. But still, once you get moving, doing something, there's clarity that comes. Mm-hmm. I think that's really critical.
We could use more people on every single service team in our church.
Right. When people are like, what can I do? I'm like, pick a thing,
Yeah, don't be shy.
Yeah.
I would add to that too. I think that think of a story, like try to find that thing, whether it's inside or outside the church. Think of a time where you felt like the flow, right? You feel like, I felt really good doing that.
The flow. That's a great way to put it.
Try to think of a time, because in the abstract may be harder, but a memory where you're like, that felt really good. Or ask somebody that you're close to, hey, when have you observed me, like me being really happy, or me seeing me like sort of light up? Mm-hmm. Kind of interesting to hear what people say, because it's not always what you think of for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you start to ask those questions and listening to people, I'm immediately thinking of Ange Mate, and sitting down with her, and we're talking about her call and like what she wants to do with her life, or just brainstorming. And I mentioned spiritual direction, and she's like, "What's that?" And I described it, and she's like, "Can I do that? Is that a thing I could do?" I'm like, "Oh boy, is it a thing?" And so oftentimes, like, we don't even. We again, the frame, we limit the options, the possibilities, thinking, like I used to think, I never want to be a pastor because I don't want to get up in a pulpit, say a whole bunch of stuff that nobody really cares about, and everybody goes home and we do the same thing next week. That sounds miserable to me. Little did I know that there's actually other ways of being a pastor. There's other traditions. And so, but I had written that off because I thought, well, I know the options, I know the possibilities. And in community with people, and getting moving, it can really disrupt what you expect, your assumptions that you didn't even realize you had. What are the possibilities? Have an openness, have a willingness to risk things, to be wrong about things, but get moving, trying things, and just pay attention. And I think likely what will happen is you'll find that God has uniquely equipped you to do certain things. And when you get to that place, let's say step one is taking care of people are sort of moving. How do you know when you're operating your gifts? What's the feedback you get from other people? How does it feel? What's the experience of that? What do you guys think about that? How do you know when you're like landing in that sweet spot, the flow? What's that sense? How would you describe that? If people are listening and going, but how do I know?
I use the analogy of the shoes not fitting.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, the shoes fit. It feels, it's really hard to articulate, but I think that for me, like finding ministry, it's like, oh, this feels right. Like this feels like what God's created me to do. And obviously that's, if you're talking about serving at the church, it may not feel that, that huge. But I mean, I started just by serving at the coffee cart at Res. And so, starting small and just resting in that for a bit and kind of seeing where God takes you.
Paying attention.
Yeah.
I also don't know that I think it's true that there's like the flow or whatever, how you describe that, where it's like, there's something attached to like, this feels good or this, but I also don't, I'm trying to think of a good example of this, but like, so for me, I just had someone back, I was in Milwaukee recently, and a family friend asked like, how do you feel about being a pastor or priest? Like what, now that you're 15 years in. And I said, well, there's no question in my mind that I'm called to this work. it doesn't always feel good.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
It doesn't. There are days where it is hard work, and there are days where it's like, man, like, and so I think and yet there are days where it's like, yes, this is exactly.
It doesn't always feel good, but it feels right.
Right. That's the difference. So I think that's really that's where some discernment needs to happen, because it's not always like, oh, I get to do this thing where I love it and it always feels great. It's like sometimes it's not fun. Sometimes you don't want to have to get up and go serve in the kids ministry. But there is a calling, or there is this gift that you have. And this is also why I like the Nouwen quote, is because he talks about offering what you have. Like, it doesn't have to be, maybe you've got 4 kids under the age of 6 and you're like, I don't have a lot to offer. Just offer what you have, and maybe that doesn't mean serving officially in a ministry, but use your gifts and serve the church, even in small ways, like, I think that's important. But it's not that we shouldn't do things that we like to do. I think the discernment goes a little bit deeper than that, though. It's like, sometimes we like it. Sometimes
that's a really good point.
Sometimes
feels like a discipline.
Like it. Sometimes it'll be hard. But it is that sense of like, oh yeah, I am using my gift right now because people, like, the church needs people who can pastor, who can come alongside of people. The church needs people who can be prophetic, even when it's hard to be prophetic at times. The church needs, so there's that kind of, it is like a combination of, sometimes it feels good. Sometimes it's like, oh, I'm affirmed right now because this is what I love to do. This is what I'm passionate about. And sometimes it's like, yeah, I don't love this.
There's a deeper thing that you're pointing to here, right? It's like there's again, a groundedness. That
flow state you're talking about, it is a deeper thing, right? It's like it is this kind of sense of like, I don't know, sometimes this is great, sometimes it's not so great, but man, God's here,
Yeah. For me, I would describe that as is that sense that you're experiencing the favor of God, the joy of God, the peace of God, the clarity of God. Like, there's something about that transcends, or really undergirds, all the ups and down moments where you're like, I hate this, or this is hard, this is costly. There's something underneath that's carrying all this. And I think this is what Paul's getting at when he's saying being rooted and grounded in love, this having this life with God, right? A union with Christ is the building block for the rest of this, because in that undergirding place, in that relationship with God, you're the benefactor. You receive these gifts of peace, of joy. This is why the gifts in the church aren't just handouts. They're not we never want to so pursue the gifts that we forget the one who's giving them. We actually can't receive those gifts apart from a relationship with the giver of that gift. And I'll just sort of say the obvious, maybe here it's not so obvious, but the gift is Christ. The gift is union with God. And so if we're wondering what our gifts are, it's always built on the first gift, the greatest gift, which is the love of God that we have in Christ and union with him. That's the life that we have. And in that space, Ryan, I think is where that sort of unshakable peace, or that comfort, the joy of knowing I'm right where God has called me to be. I know, or like I should be doing this. Is almost untouchable, because it's, I think, safe within that life and that union with God. That can weather all of the ups and downs, right? All that stuff.
Yeah. And I think there's an important distinction to be made here between, like, we've been talking a lot about like vocational discernment. Yep. Like, what are you going to do with your life? Because that's what we did to decide to become priests. And then there's like discerning your gifts for like use by the church.
Totally.
So like my husband, for example, committed, faithful Christian, has never felt a call to ministry. He's always kind of joke. I mean, he's sort of like the happy to ride shotgun, best friends, wife, or called to ministry. He has never, ever felt a call to ministry. He's called to be a lawyer, and he does that well, and he thrives in that. And so he's having to discern, like, how do I work in this like rough and tumble, like highly conflict driven environment, witnessing to the goodness of God.
And that is actually a ministry.
It is, absolutely. And his ministry it looks different. It's something else. He also serves the church because he's part of the body, and he uses his gifts in ways to serve the church as well as his time permits. So we're not necessarily saying everybody, you need to quit what you're doing and come spend all your time and energy serving the church. We just, I think there's two things. I think it's important to discern the vocation that God has given you inside or outside the church. But it's also important to use your spiritual gifting for the work of the church as a member of the body.
Right. Back to Nouwen's quote, finding your gifts and offering what you have is super critical here. Thank God not everybody's called to be clergy, right? We don't need that. What we need is people going, what do I have? What has God given me in the place that I am? What's God doing here? What's the good word that I'm hearing from the Spirit? What is it that I love? What is it that people say I'm like gifted at? So that could look like, man, I got like 6 kids. I don't have a lot I can carve out here, but I can pray for people. Pray for people. There's a gifting in that. Or hey, I'm not like the greatest orator, but I love to open my home and welcome people. Do that. Or I have the ministry presence. I'm good at that. I'm a good listener. Man, I'm generous. I'm like really, I love giving. Time or talents or money. Like there's a gift of generosity. Man, I love standing with the vulnerable and speaking a word of justice and mercy. You know what I mean? Like if you think about your life and what you've been given, you'll find oftentimes the clues. It's already there. God's already present and at work. You're not discovering something brand new. You're discovering gifts is sort of like dusting off or unearthing something that's been growing there, usually for a long time. So it's actually kind of exciting to think what's been planted in your life in that garden, like you speak about, Ryan. And what's God breathing into life and fanning into flame?
It reminds me, and I'm sure I'm taking this from somewhere, or it's not a new thought for sure, but like when you were talking about the apostles, priests, or apostles, prophets, like that, those are maybe callings to leadership in the church in certain ways that some are called to, maybe not everyone, but everyone probably has some gifting in one of those areas. And sometimes you're called to lead in that way. Then there's gifts that are just like you were talking about, hospitality and prayer, service, things like that, everyone in the church is called to participate in some way. And then we all have like gifts. Like I'm thinking of like the fruits of the Spirit, just like basic fundamental things we're all called to embody in our work. Like Ryan goes to work. There's a calling to display the fruit of the Spirit in his work. That's hard to do as a lawyer, I would imagine. Just like it's probably hard to display them in other professions. Like there's a calling that we all have to use our gifts and our talents and the fruit of the Spirit in those spaces. So there's probably like different ways I think that would be helpful to break this out with people.
But there's calling that all Christians have, and then there's unique gifts that
to build up the church.
Yeah, right.
And then there's like the leadership gifts that some are called to. Maybe that's is that
I think I was just thinking of going back to where should you start. I mean, you take our Sin class, which starts September the 8th.
We should have started with that.
We should have. We're terrible at this.
Just because it's like this
it only
really
took us
is
an hour to figure that
about.
out. Well, that's actually a great place to land. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for listening and watching. We hope this is helpful in discerning your gifts. And again, if this is something that you want to talk more about, just reach out to us and tell us. We would love to journey with you and ask those questions, and even name. I love naming people's like gifting, the things that I go, oh, hey, I see this and you're really good at this. I love that. So if we can be of help to you, Res folks, let us know, raise your hand or contact us, email us, do something. We'd love to do that with you. Thanks for listening. God bless you. We'll see you guys next time.